Yeah, and I think for a lot of people that this can be very difficult to take on board, to recognise this role, but yet hopefully the way that you're explaining it, people are recognising it also makes a huge amount of sense. You know, there's obviously a number of different psychology-based treatments that are out there, which have been attempted to use with ME with, I guess, limited amounts of success in some cases. But maybe it's worth talking about, for example, a little bit about CBT, known as cognitive behavioural therapy, which is one of the kind of more modern forms of psychology on the more traditional system. And maybe we'll talk about some other treatment ideas in a bit as well, but maybe starting there.
Yeah, well, CBT is obviously what's by and large available in the NHS from the NICE guidelines and so forth. And not to knock it, I think it very much has its role. CBT is really the development of psychology and psychotherapy to date to really take into account the role of the mind in sort of behaviour and the creation of behaviour. But CBT is being used to manage ME. It's not, first off, really being used to treat with much expectation that it will necessarily help physically. And the reason behind that is because all it really is dealing with is the mind. So it's dealing with our thought patterns and management and stress. Now, to some extent, that should help. But my experience is that it would take a very long time to get to the point where it helps. And that's because when we talked earlier about the conscious and the unconscious, well, the conscious mind is only a tiny proportion of what's happening in the whole system. So this logical mind up here that can think and process information is part of the machine, part of this wondrous system, but it's only a little facet of it. And the problem with CBT is it only deals with that one layer. And a lot of what's happening is emotionally led, is subconsciously led, is that body wisdom, that whole holistic view, really. So CBT is going to be limited in the way that it approaches things. It's helping to retrain the conscious mind when, in fact, a huge amount of what's happening really needs to dig deeper than that, to more of the unconscious layers and the emotional layers of what's going on.
And I think what also, my sense, will be quite challenging for patients is when they're just offered CBT, it's kind of like saying, well, it's all in your mind and there's no treatment that can be done on a physical side. And alongside CBT often also goes graded exercise and pacing. Maybe some of your thoughts around that, maybe we could just briefly explain for those watching that don't know what ME is, what those treatments are, but also some of your thoughts around those.
Well, as you say, I mean, CBT only deals with one facet, and because it doesn't make the mind-body link particularly, people are left thinking that if they just change their mindset, you know, it will either get better or it won't get better, but they can manage it. So quite limiting. Yeah, graded exercise and pacing, I think both really have their place. But the problem with ME is that it is an umbrella term for basically lots of subsets of what's going on. For some people, beginning to pace their activity, by which we mean do a certain amount of a certain activity followed by resting, followed by a certain amount of maybe a different activity followed by resting, and really get very, very formalised with that, quite strict with that, can be helpful. It's usually helpful for people who had a tendency to completely ignore their body and race ahead and do everything that they could and, you know, pay no attention to themselves. But again, it's limiting. For some people, it will make quite a lot of difference, but it very often won't get them the whole way. For others, it can even become a problem. And what I mean by that is we see a lot of people who've been put in very strict pacing regimes where the pacing regime takes over their life. And in fact, because intrinsically we talked about being in stress and maybe anxiety, if you have to pace really rigidly and you're already stressed, it becomes another source of stress. So pacing can be useful, but limited.
So it's almost like it can break somebody out of the booming and busting of overdoing it and then crashing. But what you're saying is someone can only speak on the phone for 3 3/4 minutes, for example, which we've actually come across things extreme as that.
Absolutely.
Then if someone's on for even, being extreme, but even another 10 seconds, they can then go into anxiety that they're worrying that they're overdoing it and they're doing too much.
I had patients who were timing to the second with stopwatches. And it became a massive feature of their anxiety that they feared they couldn't do more. And that very fear meant that if they went a few seconds over, their whole system would spring into high stress. Not very helpful, obviously, when we're talking about being in healing state as opposed to stress state. So that's a facet of it. I think the other thing to say is we talked about body intelligence. And, well, your body knows intrinsically. And this, again, may sound a little weird, but a lot of my learning was that my body had a sense of what was right for it in any moment. If you think back to far more simple times, then intrinsically we are at some level animals. That's what we came from. And animals don't think about what to eat and when to eat. They just do it instinctively and naturally. And we instinctively and naturally know when to eat and when to stop and when to rest and what we need, and far more complex things than that. So my idea of real pacing is when you learn to listen to your body, as opposed to making it an external, logical mind thing that you do X and Y for, certain amounts of time. It just doesn't make sense long term.
So, and that being pacing, how about graded exercise, which has had a huge amount of kind of negative press from a lot of ME patients, like many ways for good reasons. Maybe explaining how you see that. Again,
and I think you've talked a little about nutrition in other programs and the different kind of physical things that are going on. For some patients, beginning to gradually build up exercise at certain points in their illness or at certain points in their recovery, more to the point, can be helpful. But the problem is, for a lot of people, what's happening is the body is still burnt out. You're still in this stress state most of the time. Physically, there can be all sorts of things like adrenals completely burnt out, and the mitochondria, which I think you've talked about, the kind of battery cells of the body, not really working. And then you try and push. And it's a bit like trying to push a car uphill with no petrol. There's nothing there to use. You've got to get the body into the right state and start to get some of the right things in place. And then you begin to have the energy to actually start to exercise. So I think the problem is that for quite a large subsection of people with ME, they've pushed and it's made them worse. And that's the problem with graded exercise. So again, all useful stuff, but just used in the right way, in the right time, for the right people.
So what you're referring to is different things at different stages of the illness. And